This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning everyone. We're continuing with possibly the main part of the subject, the ethics of war and halacha, warfare and innocent civilians. Yesterday in part 3, we brought that Rav Goren built the foundation of his ideology, that the ethics of war are governed by the precedent of the Torah. Rav Goren marshaled the story of Shechem, who was murdered by Shimon and Levi, that even according to the Rambam, it was not legitimate what they did. And even according to the Rambam, that it was legitimate halachically because they didn't set up courts, but nevertheless Yaakov criticized them, and Rav Goren developed an idea that when it comes to murder, there's a certain higher standard called Mishnas Chasidim that we see from Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that even though he had no alternative but to turn in this individual, nevertheless Eliyahu would not speak with him because he did not meet the bill of Mishnas Chasidim. So it's interesting, Rav Goren looked at the episode of Shimon and Levi, and instead of saying, well, Shimon and Levi killed out the city and they had the last word, they said, Hakazoni Yasas Hakasenu. So let's learn from there that if someone of a nation attacks us, we're authorized to obliterate the entire community. He came to the exact opposite conclusion, and he built his whole edifice based on that story. However, one of the most classic Mefarshim arrives at the exact opposite conclusion, and upon which most legitimate sources base their ideology of the ethics of war upon the Maharal, who reached the exact opposite conclusion that we brought from Rav Goren yesterday. And so Rav Goren built this edifice of higher standard. No, today we're going to learn there is a very traditional viewpoint that from the episode of Shimon and Levi, we could learn out something called collective responsibility. Which means, if you have a nation of 1 million people, and an individual from that nation, representative of the body of that nation, commits an atrocity against us, there is no such thing as innocent. There's collective responsibility. Okay, and let's see that in part 4, page 15. This might be the most important Maramakim in a certain sense. Okay, we're going to page 15, right hand column, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines from the bottom. Ach Kasha. Page 15. Ach Kasha. Im Shechem chata, kol ha'ir ma'chatu la'roig. Shechem sinned. Did the whole city sin? So the Maharal quotes the Rambam that Bnei Noach are mitzuva and dinim, and one avera that they're over, they're neharagan, and because the city did not set up dinim, they're all chayiv misa. So the Maharal asks, the Rambam is a tema. Look 5 lines from the bottom. Uve'emes dvar temahim. The words of the Rambam are astounding. Elu advarim. These words are astounding. Ki eich efshar lohem ladon es ben nasi haaretz. Is it possible for a community to judge the son of the king? Ki hayurei mehem. Certainly the people of the city were fearful of him. V'afagav shenetstavel adinim, even though they are commanded on dinim. Hainu kishayuchlu ladon. That's if they're able to adjudicate. Avol oines rachmana patre. If it's an extenuating circumstance, there's no question they're exempt. Ve'ich efshar lohem ladon oisam. How would it be possible to judge them? So therefore the Maharal summarily rejects the Rambam. Says the Maharal, Venira, Deloy Kashamidi, listen carefully. Mishum Deloy Dami, Shnei Umais, Kagoin Bnei Yisrael Ukanaaniyim. We cannot compare two nations, like Bnei Yisrael and Canaan. Shehem Shnei Umais, they're two different nations. How do we know they're two different nations? Because they proposed, V'hayinu la'am echad. Let's be one nation. That implies u'metchila lo nechshav la'am echad. Ulefikach hutar lahem lilchaim kedin uma shebal lilchaim al uma acheres. Therefore, it is permitted to wage war like the law of one nation that comes to battle another nation. Shehitira haTorah. The Torah allows war, and war means inevitable, innocent people will die. Doesn't the Torah say, "Ve'afagav de'amra Torah ki sikra v'lir li'lachem aleh"? If you approach the city to fight, "Ve'karasei la l'shalom," then you have to give them opportunity to do peace. Yeah, Hainu heicha d'lo yasu l'Yisrael davar. Of course, you have to give an opportunity to do peace. If you're going to attack a nation, you have to say, "Shalom aleichem, nation. This is our land. Knock, knock. The IDF is here. Leave immediately so nobody gets hurt." And over the years, I think in 2008, they developed a system of advanced door knocking. Instead of actually door knocking, they call the personal cell phones of civilians in Gaza and say, "We're about to bomb the area in 5 minutes. Get out, or your life is on the line." And very often they wouldn't leave. So they developed an even more advanced technique. They drop some type of missile on the house that causes very minor damage and a big explosion and doesn't cost life. And people get scared. So the civilians who wanted to be stubborn against their better judgment leave out of fear. And then they drop the real bomb when the civilians leave. That's a technique they've developed. No other nation in the world does anything remotely similar to that. And it's against their best interest because the unwanteds there also are warned, and they're given ample time to escape very often. But the Maharal says, of course you have to give them the opportunity to make peace. That's when they did it, they're unprovoked. But when they commit an atrocity against us, if they act against the Jewish people, for example, in the case of Shechem, that they breached the barriers of propriety, to do this atrocity, even though it was only one of them, kivan demechalal ha'amhu, since they're part of the nation, kivan shepartzu lahem tchila, they started mutarim likach mikmasam mehem. Revenge is permitted against who? The entire nation. When do you have to open in peace? If they didn't attack us, if they were unprovoked. So you say, we need to conquer. We're giving you time to leave with your lives. Then you open with peace. But when one person provokes us, there is no concept of, now let's decide who is innocent and who is guilty. There's something called war. But war, milchama. Eis shalom ve'eis milchama. And at a time of war, there's collective responsibility. Says the Maharal, v'hachinami kol milchamos shehim nimtzaim. All warfare is like this. Kagoin sroras hamidyanim. You think every Midianite committed an evil act against the Jewish people? There were some good Midianites. There were some upstanding citizens. No. There's something called Eis Milchama. And in the time of Eis Milchama, you're allowed to go to war. There's collective responsibility. Af agav dahayu harbe shlei asa ein ze chiluk kivan shahayu ba'oisa uma sha'asa rad lahem. Since there was among this nation that did evil to them, mutarim lavai alehem l'malchama, you're allowed to go to war against them. V'chein heim kol ha'malchama. This is the very nature of all warfare. So you see from the Maharal an exact opposite conclusion that Rav Goren drew. Rav Goren said, well, Yaakov Avinu was upset at them, so even though maybe halachically it was sanctioned, but they need to act above and beyond the call of duty. No, the Maharal says that from the actions of Shimon and Levi we see there's something called collective responsibility. Now, if the Maharal was just left at this, then we would say this is just his perush on Chumash. Now, I want to bring up a very interesting question. This Maharal seems to contradict the Gur Aryeh we saw yesterday. Because the Gur Aryeh we saw yesterday implies that Yaakov Avinu was afraid he might Shema Yarog Acherim. He might kill civilians. What was he afraid of? So what if he might kill civilians? But what about collective responsibility? Esav's coming to attack him. They're guilty parties. There might be innocent parties. But what about the logic of the Maharal? That everyone is responsible. Esav was coming to kill him. There's an unprovoked attack. So, Shuveino Mavchin, Ben Sadik L'Rasha. In other words, according to this, how does this ideology of the Maharal fit in with what Yaakov Avinu was afraid of Yiro Yaakov Oid Vayetzela? This Rav Asher Weiss asked in the Minchas Asher. What? Was he an Ummah? So my father-in-law is saying very good that maybe the logic of the Maharal only applies if it's nation versus nation. So then we could say that the entity, if somebody acts on behalf of the entity of a nation, there's collective responsibility upon the whole nation. But Rav Asher Weiss says, Esav is not an Ummah. Esav is he's his brother. He's a lone personality. He might have other people joining him, but would they be categorized as an Ummah? Perhaps not. And then we don't necessarily apply this logic of the Maharal, collective responsibility, or Rav Asher Weiss says maybe collective responsibility would apply, but nevertheless it's still not something that we're happy that we have to do, and Yaakov Avinu was still distressed that he would perhaps rightfully be killing innocent people. Those are two possibilities. A very controversial, and I'm only bringing this up, and again, there's no authorization to clip and shorten any sound bites from this series, because many of the things I'm telling you are for the sake of your appreciation, understanding of the historical process of how these different approaches develop. So some of the personalities, it's worthwhile to know about, whether you agree or disagree with their particular ideology. A very controversial sefer was written called Toras HaMelech from Rabbi Yitzchak Shapira and Rabbi Yosef Elitzur. That it was so controversial, it was brought, I believe, to the Supreme Court of Israel. And the accusation was that this book is inciting violence, because it basically marshaled this Maharal as a justification for the army that any time there's any type of lone attack, to take wholesale revenge. And this was brought to the Supreme Court, and the ultimate decision was that it was not considered a federal crime. This sefer was not a federal, but it was a very controversial sefer. And the name of it again is Toras HaMelech, and one of the main pillars of the book is this Maharal, that the idea of collective responsibility. And there was a sefer written against the Toras HaMelech. It was called Derech HaMelech. Now obviously the Toras HaMelech was embraced by the very nationalistic movements in Israel. And there's a sefer Derech HaMelech by Rabbi Ariel Finkelstein, and he has a haskama, if you look at number 28, on page 20, from a Rav Yaakov Ariel, who says that relying on this Maharal, if you look in Oy Zayin, to create the ideology of collective responsibility, and therefore everyone is chayiv misa. Now listen carefully. There are really two ways of saying the Maharal. Does the Maharal mean to say that even though they're innocent people, but nevertheless they're part of one entity, and everyone therefore is chayiv misa? That's how the Toras HaMelech presented the Maharal. So the Rav Yaakov Ariel argued, no, that's not what the Maharal means. The Maharal doesn't mean that because of collective responsibility, everyone is chayiv misa. What the Maharal means, because of collective responsibility, the other nation is authorized to go to war. And once you go to war, it's not practically possible to differentiate between the innocent and the guilty. It's not that the innocent are now chayiv misa. They're not chayiv misa. They're still innocent. But the other warring nation is authorized to go to war, and under those circumstances, it's not possible to differentiate and distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. So Rav Yaakov Ariel feels, again, this created a tremendous stir in the state of Israel. You know? Exact, very good point. There's a book, and a lot of the sources from this shiur I got from this book. It's called The Ethics of Our Fighters. And he argues against collective responsibility that, in fair reasoning, what if a right-wing settler committed an act? Does that mean the other side is now authorized to take wholesale revenge? But even the more tempered view of collective responsibility, that it's not that everyone is liable to the Chiyuv Misa, but now you're allowed to go to war, and once you go to war, you can't distinguish anymore. That doesn't really make things that much better, right? By the way, so Rabbi Yaakov Ariel says that the lumdus is not that because of collective responsibility, everyone is chayiv misa. The lumdus is, once there's collective responsibility, you're allowed to go to war. And once you go to war, it's not practical, lahavchin, bein sadik l'rasha, but you need to try, and therefore you need to do door knocking, and you need to warn them, and you need to give them maybe a safe corridor to leave. The bottom line is, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, just so, for the sake of honesty, and Lamaisa, the Poskim who discussed this issue, and namely Rav Hershel Shechter in the Sefer Be'ikvei Hatzayin, and Rav Asher Weiss in the Minchas Asher, Parsha Shoftim, and it's actually quoted in a new book by Tzvi Reisman. What is it called again? Contemporary Halachic Dilemmas, that I just got. He quotes the view of Rav Hershel Shechter, Rav Asher Weiss, as like the absolute conclusion on this, that based on the Maharal, as controversial as the Torah Samelech may have seemed, the Poskim seem to go with it. Not like Rav Goren, that once the enemy provokes us and they commit an atrocity against us, we're permitted to go to war. And of course, the goal is not to take revenge on any innocent civilians, and with all respect to all of mankind and all human life, and kol makayim nefesh kilu kiyem olam malei. And of course, in Judaism, not only Jewish life, but the life of any human being is of supreme value. But nevertheless, there are times that war is legitimate, and under those circumstances, how are you supposed to eliminate a terrorist if there's a human shield? It is completely permitted for an army to eliminate those who pose a danger to their citizens, despite the fact that they're going to be innocent casualties. Based on this Maharal. That's the conclusion of Rav Hershel Shechter in Be'ikvei Hatzayin, as well as Rav Asher Weiss in Minchas Asher, Parsha Shoftim. I don't want anybody quoting my opinion. I'm here as a reporter to report to you the conclusion of the poskim that discussed this issue today. So, for example, in Be'ikvei Hatzayin, and it's interesting, it was published by ArtScroll. ArtScroll published that this is the halacha conclusion, and these are the poskim that discuss it. So take a look on page 24. 24. He says, now, Rav Hershel Shechter is talking about, let's say there's a lone terrorist attack. So is the army authorized to go in, eliminate that terrorist, and knock out the whole building? You say, well, it's not a war. Did that terrorist act at a Shas Milchama? So Rav Shechter says, since 1948, it has a din of Shas Milchama. It's all a continuation of one Shas Milchama. And Rav Asher Weiss seems to say the same thing, that there's no such thing as a lone terrorist act. It's all part of Milchama. And if you take a look on page 25, V'alpi hadvarim ha'eleh hayanira loymar duha din nami v'kal v'choymer hu b'zman hazeh she Yisrael ha'med esi b'matzav shel Milchama that we're at time where v'chol haprois v'hamhumay shabiyamenu dinam kehemshach me'amacham rishayna sharei ha'aravim tayanim befeirush uvefem malei sheim roitzim es Yerushalayim ve'es Tel Aviv ve'es Haifa. Yeah, they don't say, we'll be happy with, we're happy with Kan Yunis. That's all we need. We know what their chant is. We know what their mantra is. Umamelo tzrichim anshe tzal linoig im kol hamishtatfim be'elu aprois kemoi she'noyagim b'shas milchama mamish shem yesh tzorech b'kach sheyaru bahem almanas laharoig v'im yesh tzorech b'kach ki lefamim menanimno levarer mi hem hamachablim v'hatrodistim hama'argenes aprois azmuos Rashon b'chayom tzal lahakos v'af laharoig k'fi hadrush af acherim meyoysa uma shehem chafim mipesha. There's full-fledged right to fight and to react as you would at a time of Milchama. Where does this come from? Kemavuar b'gor aryeh l'maral miprag l'parshas vayishlach. Just say, what was considered a radical view is in a way, presented here, and it's codified by Art Scroll. He says, okay, fine, that's his conclusion. And if we take a look in on the Minchas Hashem, page 29, Maharal, Dezet Toras HaMilchama. Shekal ha'uma nachsheves leguf echad. The whole nation's like one body. V'chal ha'mishtayich le'uma sha'anu nechamba huter damai. Anyone that's part of this nation that we're fighting, his blood is permitted. Dikivan she'atir atar li'lachem umazu kol b'nei ha'uma keguf echad heim v'huter damam u'lefi derach zeh Af l'chachila muter largam ve'in tzarich l'shtadel b'hatzalosim shaleilu shalei chatu. He argues even further. No door knocking is necessary. Meaning, that which the haskama of the Sefer Derech HaMelech wanted to say, no, the lamdus is not that they're chayiv misa. The lamdus is, even though they're not chayiv misa, but practically efshar levarer. Rav Asher Weiss says that's not the lamdus of the Gur Aryeh. The lamdus is Hutra. No distinguishing is required. So, that's a very important and fundamental factor. We're not here to give halachic conclusions, but to be aware of, Rav Goren looked at the episode of Shimon and Levi, and he derived that according to the Ramban, it was halachically forbidden. It's halachically forbidden to go to war against the whole nation. And even according to the Rambam, even though it's halachically permitted, but you have to act above and beyond Mishnas Chasidim. And the Maharal looks at the story and derives that at a completely opposite viewpoint. And Rav Shechter and Rav Asher Weiss says, accordingly, it would be permitted even l'chadchila. So, you embark on this topic of the ethics of war, and you say, okay, are we allowed to look at the episodes of Chumash? Even if we are allowed to look at the episodes of Chumash, you could study the same episode and arrive at two very disparate conclusions. Okay, so that's part 4 of the series, and a very important part. We're now going to move on to part 5. Part 5 is the Iker Lamdus of the Sugya. And the question is, how can a soldier go to war and risk his life? Going to war is not one of the 3 mitzvahs that you could give up your life for.
Okay. You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.